Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're going to begin the program very shortly. In fact, we're going to start with a video. We'll explain a little bit more about it afterwards, but we hope you enjoy. It's really incredible footage. I don't think anyone has ever seen it before in the US. So I hope you take it all in, enjoy this moment, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Ni Guaranime, Radio Havana, Cuba, Guibé.
Noir, Radio Havana, Cuba,
Peuple invincible.
Un programme spécial
sua
de
programação
et
português
Christian
para o Brasil.
Marcignac,
Le supplémentaire que représente pour nous la conférence tricontinentale
Nuestro
ne
país
nous a pas laissé le temps
ha
matériel
hecho el máximo por hacer agradable la estancia de las delegaciones aquí. Ha desbordado todo el entusiasmo y toda la hospitalidad y todo el calor de que es capaz. Miles de cubanos, incesantemente, sin atender a descanso, sin atender a vacaciones, han trabajado por el éxito de esta conferencia. Han trabajado por atender a las representaciones de los pueblos hermanos. Nuestro pueblo todo ha vivido en estos días la gran fiesta de la solidaridad internacional. No se nos escapa la trascendencia de este acto que culmina en la noche de hoy. frente a todos los augurios del imperialismo,
Observers and friends, the Indian delegation has traveled
frente a todos
many
sus
thousand miles
pronósticos,
across 2 continents to reach this lovely and beautiful capital of the heroic
la gran esperanza de que esta conferencia no concluyera en nada, de que esta conferencia, girando alrededor de los problemas del movimiento comunista internacional, estaba llamada a dividirse.
لقد كان حلما عظيما أن نتواجد ونلتقي اليوم معا هنا في هافانا عاصمة كورة
Y
سوريا،
estaba llamada
ولم يكن سهلا تحقيق هذا الحلم وهذا الأمل الكبير، لكن عزيمة الأحرار والمناضلين حققت
ha
الحلم
ocurrido
وحققت الأمل.
lo que tal vez
من أطراف معمورة
menos
لتنظموا
o
صفوفكم
quizás nunca
وتوحدوا جهودكم
esperaron.
في تنظيم كبير
Que la conferencia
يضم ممثلين
haya
لشعوب
sido un éxito.
우리
En esta
전국민의 형제,
conferencia
영적 쿠바 인민과
se
피델
haya
카스트로
creado
수사에게 열렬한 인사를 전합니다.
un
combatientes
organismo de carácter
de los tres
tricontinental.
continentes. La delegación cubana saluda a todos los combatientes antiimperialistas que integran esta conferencia como representantes genuinos de los pueblos hermanos de África, Asia y América Latina.
Dear friends, sisters and brothers,
Y no solo eso,
allow me, now that we are ending our great Tricontinental Conference with success,
mucho a los imperialistas, y es
La solidaridad de los pueblos afroasiáticos
De
y
Cuba.
latinoamericanos. Resolución sobre Vietnam. La primera conferencia de solidaridad de los pueblos de Asia, África y América Latina. Para nosotros
de la organización
que un solo camino, la lucha, y no hay más que una sola consigna para todos los continentes: patria o muerte para África, Asia y América Latina.
sin alardes, sin inmodestias de ningún tipo. Así entendemos los revolucionarios cubanos nuestro deber internacionalista. Así entiende nuestro pueblo sus deberes, porque entiende que el enemigo es uno, el mismo que nos ataca a nosotros en nuestras costas y en nuestras tierras, el mismo que ataca a los demás. Y por eso decimos y proclamamos que con combatientes cubanos podrá contar el movimiento revolucionario en cualquier rincón de la tierra. Nuestro pueblo ha sentido como suyo todos y cada uno de los problemas de los demás pueblos. Nuestro pueblo, como les dije el 2 de enero, los recibió con los brazos abiertos y los despide con los brazos cerrados como símbolo de un lazo que no se romperá más y como símbolo de sus sentimientos fraternales y solidarios hacia los demás pueblos que luchan, por los cuales está dispuesto a dar también su sangre. Patria o muerte, venceremos.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the People's Forum. I heard a lot of smiles, I heard laughter, I heard cheering, and I think that's the spirit we should bring with us into this conversation, right? Has anyone heard of the Tricontinental Conference before? Okay, a lot of people. Well, that's excellent news, because that's a history that has been taken from us in many ways here in the US. So I tip my hat to all of you for undertaking a study. And for those who are here to continue exploring, welcome. I don't know if you've been here before, but if you haven't, this is the People's Forum. It is a political education center, a community center. We have many different offerings, all in the service of serving our working class liberation movements, both here in the US and also abroad. We actually have, I'll take it. So if you haven't been here before, we actually have ongoing courses. Right now, for example, we have a course on hidden histories of rebellion in the US, which uncovers, again, these erased histories, these histories that have been robbed from us that make us feel like we don't have a historical revolutionary lineage. But in fact, we do. Every benefit that we experience today has been a struggle waged by people of our class and a victory won for us, passed on to us. And I think that is what brings us here today, to take lessons from history and apply them to our future. And so the Tricontinental Conference was a historic meeting. It brought together hundreds of revolutionaries from around the world who went beyond geographic borders, who went beyond cultural borders, who went beyond linguistic borders, all to gather in one place in Cuba. And why were they gathered there? Why did they work this hard to meet each other, to discuss, to debate? It was because they were there to answer a simple question and to build an answer. They were there to ask, how do we build solidarity against our foremost enemy, our primary enemy, the one who is waging terror on all of us? Fidel was speaking to it, an enemy that is attacking us on our lands and also people all across the world. I think you know who I'm talking about, what I'm talking about, the entity I'm talking about. In fact, what Fidel was saying, we can understand as we see ICE patrol our streets and kill protesters and kidnap people off of our streets, attacking us in our lands and across the world. We see it in Palestine. We see it in the heart of a country that has bombed 7 countries in the past year alone. Shame. And so hundreds of revolutionaries were moved by this question. How do we build solidarity? Not just by the question, not just by discussing it, debating it, but by answering it with action. And so that is the conference that we are here to celebrate today, and its 60th anniversary, which was celebrated just last month. And so to that end, we are here to celebrate a new book that we have launched. It has a long title because it is trying to gather so much together. It is called Tricontinental Havana, 1966, Speeches and Documents of the First Solidarity Conference of the Peoples for Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And it's a translation which brings this history to a new audience, a new generation of fighters for liberation 60 years later. And so, to all of the history that I mentioned before, there are so many parallels that we can already dig into in terms of connecting our history to our present. But of course, we're not here just to glamorize history. We are not here just to reminisce on the past, but we are here to, poke it, to question it, to prod it, to interrogate it, to admire it, to extract all of these lessons so that we can be better fighters today. And I think that takes me well into our next point, which is that this conference, of course, was held in Havana, Cuba, which is, it was a very deliberate decision, a symbolic one, but also a material one. Because at the time, Cuba was a site of hope for national liberation struggles around the world. And it was a site of hope back then, and it's still a site of hope today. But last month, we also are seeing Trump continue to tighten its grip on Cuba, to continue to strangle Cuba by signing an executive order preventing even a single drop of fuel from getting to the Cuban people. Shame. Shame. It is disgusting. It is disgusting how we have allowed 60 years of horrible, atrocious acts to be acted upon a little island just 90 miles off of our southern shore, because it poses that much of a threat, because its history, its legacy, poses that much of a threat to US imperialism, right? And so This decision that Trump has made is one that will affect transportation, it will create food shortages, it will affect tourism, it will affect the healthcare system, all of these things that are necessary for the Cuban people to survive and thrive. And so the objective we see is clear, to induce systemic failure, to try and topple the revolution. But will that happen? Will that happen? I feel like we can say it with more conviction because we know, we see, 60 years of history has taught us what the Cuban people are standing for. And we aren't standing alongside them in solidarity just because we agree with them, just because we sympathize with them, but because they are our comrades in the struggle, and they are the ones who are fighting on the front lines against US imperialism. And so Cuba wasn't just a symbol of hope, it was the concretization of it, right? It's not just the feeling of hope, but the actual real material reality that our revolutions can win, right? And that was a gift that we can never repay, except by creating revolution where we are. And so with that, I'm honored to welcome Ambassador Yuri Gala, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative of Cuba to the UN, who has joined us today. And he'll be able to speak a few more words about Cuba, about his work, about the role and the tasks that we have today, and then we'll get into the conversation. Sound good? All right.
Good evening to you all. Buenas noches. I think the audience speaks Spanish. All right. Well, dear friends, let me start by expressing our deep appreciation to the organizers of this very important event, and we are very grateful to them for extending an invitation to the Permanent Mission of Cuba to the United Nations to be in attendance to this book launch by Vijay Prashad and Manolo De Los Santos. We are very, very happy to be here, and indeed we are honored to be here because of the topic of this event, which is the Tricontinental Conference. And with that, let me start by saying that, yes, that video that you just saw is very significant for all those people who believe in a better world. And we Cubans are very confident that at some point we will have a better world. In January 1966, Havana was indeed the setting for an event that had a profound historical significance, the Tricontinental Conference, officially the first solidarity conference of the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That meeting gathered delegations from dozens of countries and national liberation movements around the world. At a time when most of the world was still living under colonialism, apartheid, or various forms of external domination. And when we talk about the Tricontinental Conference, we have to obviously make special reference to Fidel Castro, the historic leader of the Cuban Revolution, as you could see in the video that was shown. Fidel Castro was deeply involved on that, and the speeches and the comments that he made. Well, for those who didn't see it before, now you just saw it. And let me also mention that this year, 2026, is very special for Cubans and for many people in the world because we are indeed marking the centennial of the birth of Fidel Castro. So in August of this year, we will mark the 100th anniversary of the birth of Fidel Castro, the historic leader of the Cuban Revolution. The Tricontinental Conference was not just a political meeting. it represented the crystallization of a powerful idea. The idea that the peoples of the so-called Third World share similar historical experiences and that the solidarity among them could become a force capable of upsetting the international balance. In Havana, ideas about solidarity with independence processes were discussed, colonial wars were denounced, and the need to build a more just international order was raised. The context was particularly intense. In Asia, for example, the Vietnam War symbolized the resistance against foreign intervention. In Africa, numerous countries were in the midst of their struggle for independence or in the early years of their sovereignty. In Latin America, social and political movements seeking structural changes were growing. The Tricontinental Conference articulated these struggles in a common language of self-determination, sovereignty, and social justice. From that conference emerged the Organization of Solidarity with the Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which for years functioned as a space for political, cultural, and intellectual coordination. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Tricontinental Conference was not institutional, but symbolic. The idea that the world was not condemned to be divided solely between the great powers, and that the peoples could become decisive actors in history. Today, 60 years later, the world is different, but some of the tensions that motivated that meeting remain. Deep inequalities between the North and the South persist. Conflicts over sovereignty and resources continue, and many countries still denounce the application or implementation of economic sanctions and coercive measures that severely affect their populations. In this context, dear friends, let us recall the military attack against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in January of this year, when the constitutional president, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, Cilia Flores, were kidnapped. The government of Cuba issued a statement in which we condemn in the strongest possible terms the military aggression carried out by the United States government against Venezuela, while categorically reaffirming Cuba's absolute support and solidarity with the sister nation and its government. On the other hand, one cannot help but look at the situation in Cuba, a peaceful country which is a neighbor of the United States and that does not represent a threat to the United States national security. And let me reiterate that. Cuba is a peaceful country that does not represent a threat to the United States national interest. On the contrary, we have been willing to engage in a constructive manner and obviously taking into account that we want a peaceful and a civilized relationship. And we will talk more about that. For more than 6 decades, and this is another topic of interest, our country has lived under an economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States government. A policy that the Cuban government and the overwhelming majority of the United Nations membership have repeatedly described as a form of economic aggression or pressure that is contrary to international law. Year after year, the United Nations General Assembly has adopted resolutions calling for an end to that inhumane blockade, reflecting a significant international consensus. Just last year, more than 160 countries voted in favor of a Cuban resolution, the traditional Cuban resolution presented at the UN General Assembly. And we've been doing that for more than 30 years. So it's been more than 30 years when we started presenting that resolution calling for an end of the US blockade on Cuba. Every year, the support, or since the very beginning, back in 1992 onwards, the level of support has been increasing. And right now is perhaps one of the resolutions at the United Nations General Assembly that enjoys one of the most highest level of support by the membership. Now, in spite of that, the blockade persists. But let me tell you one thing. 165 countries cannot be wrong. 187 countries, as was the previous voting, cannot be wrong. So Cuba is on the right side of history, and we're very proud of that, and we will continue resisting that blockade with your support. Now, in terms of the impact of the US blockade on Cuba, let me mention the following. In the latest report presented by the Cuban government to the United Nations Secretary General, we highlighted that between March 2024 and February 2025, so in a period of a year, the material damage caused by the blockade to Cuba is estimated to have amounted to more than $7.5 billion US dollars. $7.5 billion US dollars. Yes, that amount of money might be nothing compared to the size of the economy of the United States. But for a tiny island in the Caribbean, which is Cuba, $7.5 billion represents a lot. Let me illustrate it better. $7.5 billion in economic damages represent more than $600 million per month. More than $600 per month. More than $20 million per day. And more than $800,000 per hour of a blockade. So, when this meeting is over, Cuba would have lost more than $800,000 as a result of the blockade, just to give you a better illustration. Now, on top of that, that blockade has been intensified or tightened in recent days, as was mentioned before, following the US military aggression against the sister nation of Venezuela and the executive order signed by the current US president on January the 29th, intended to punish any country that trades fuel with Cuba, whether directly or through a third party. You might understand what would be the implications of that, because obviously Cuba, even though we are able to produce some amount of fuel, but that is not sufficient for the entire needs of the Cuban population and the Cuban economy. And fuel will move or will be very important for electricity generation, for transportation. So we're talking here about a social impact that cannot be described through statistics alone. So we're talking about daycare centers, we're talking about hospitals, we're talking about schools, we're talking about people, human beings. That's the impact of that kind of measures that have been implemented. Now, the government of the United States has reached this point after 67 years of failing to surrender and destroy a genuine and legitimate political and revolutionary process of full sovereignty, social justice, and the promotion of peace and solidarity with the rest of the world. On the other hand, it is widely documented Cuba's historical willingness to engage in a serious, responsible dialogue with the United States government. Now, based on international law, sovereign equality, mutual respect, reciprocal benefit, non-interference in internal affairs, and absolute respect for the independence and sovereignty of states. That's the only thing that is necessary to have a respectful dialogue. Beyond the individual political positions that any person may have, the truth is that the increased aggression against Cuba raises fundamental questions that were already the focus of the Tricontinental debates. Let me start by the first one. To what extent can a small country fully exercise its sovereignty in an asymmetric international order? Second question, what is the role of international solidarity in the face of pressure and blackmail from the current superpowers? How can the people defend the right to determine their own destiny? So those are questions that are still relevant today. Remembering the Tricontinental Conference does not mean idealizing the past or ignoring the complexities of the present. It means recognizing that cooperation among the peoples and the defense of multilateralism continue to be essential tools for confronting global challenges. In a world that is re-experiencing intense geopolitical rivalries, economic crisis, and armed conflicts, the spirit of dialogue and solidarity that inspired that meeting in Havana in 1966 preserves remarkable relevance. History teaches us that conferences, declarations, and resolutions do not change the course of events, but it also shows us that ideas, when they manage to mobilize conscience and wills, can transform the realities that seem unchanging. The Tricontinental Conference was, above all, an act of affirmation. The assertion that the peoples of the global South had a voice, their own interests, and a legitimate place in building the world order. The Tricontinental Conference of 1966 reminds us that history is not predetermined, and that even in the most difficult times, the peoples have found ways to make their voices heard. This legacy, more than a memory of the past, is an invitation to the present. This is also a moment to reaffirm the relevance and growing necessity of anti-hegemonism in our struggles, to keep alive the fighting spirit, courage, and dignity embodied by the Tricontinental Conference, and which Cuba, at a very high price, has maintained unchanged. So allow me to conclude by reiterating that Cuba is also a country of brave, combatant, and a resilient people. The US government makes a mistake when it is confident that through a criminal economic pressure and the efforts to cause hardships to millions of persons, it will succeed in bending the Cuban people's determination to defend our national sovereignty and prevent the country from falling once again under the US domination. Will they achieve that? No, certainly not. The international community is now faced with the inescapable challenge to determine whether a crime of such nature could be the sign of what is yet to come, or if good sense, solidarity, and the rejection of aggression, impunity, and abuse shall prevail. We Cubans will face this new onslaught with firmness and equanimity, convinced that reason is absolutely on our side. Our determination is just one: homeland or death. We shall overcome. Patria o muerte, venceremos. Let Cuba live! 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 Thank you. Thank you very much.
Everyone, please, another round of applause for the ambassador. I get to sit now, just like all of you. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I realized in my excitement and my eagerness to introduce the ambassador and talk about Cuba, I forgot to say who's speaking with us tonight. Tonight's book was edited by a dear comrade, and the foreword was written by another dear comrade. They're both going to be joining us today. The first is the editor, who is also the founder and one of the founders and executive directors of the People's Forum, Manolo De Los Santos. Give it up. He is a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and if you haven't seen his writing before, it also appears regularly in the Monthly Review, in People's Dispatch, and Counterpunch, and all kinds of other progressive media. He also co-edited Viviremos, Venezuela versus Hybrid War, Comrade of the Revolution, Selected Speeches of Fidel Castro, and Our Own Path to Socialism, Selected Speeches of Hugo Chavez. And we also are excited to welcome Vijay Prashad. You don't want any more? Well, if you haven't heard of him before, he is a historian, journalist, and author of over 40 books, including Washington Bullets and Red Star Over the Third World. Vijay is the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, the chief correspondent for Globetrotter, and is also the chief editor of Leftward Books. And please join me in welcoming everyone to the stage while Vijay takes off his sweater. Oh yeah, all of the books that I just mentioned, and of course tonight's book, and Vijay's shirt too. It's available at 1804 Books at the front. Oh, wow! But yes, welcome to you both. Just want to welcome everyone again to this space, and I will keep our conversation somewhat brief because we want to give this space to you all to ask questions, to be these investigators of history, to be these inquirers, because I know that you all are coming from different struggles. We've already been presented with a crucial task to bring Cuba into all of the work that we're doing, to make it central, to make it unavoidable in all of the work that we do, in all of the struggles that we participate in. And so we want to hear your questions. And so I'll get us started off, but in the meantime, I hope you generate those too. It's all right, that's definitely a good omen. Well, just to get us started, why don't you two, both as historians, as writers, paint a picture of what the world was like when this conference emerged? What were the conditions that made this conference urgent or even possible at all? What were the things that led up to it?
Well, first, it's great to be here. This is the People's Forum, and I really hope you support this institution because I don't know if you can imagine a city like New York without it. So where would we hold this event? Who would allow us to have a discussion about the Cuban Revolution without attacking it? Yeah, I mean, you can talk about the Cuban Revolution, but you have to denounce it. In the People's Forum, you can celebrate it, as it should be celebrated. And we celebrate it. We celebrate it not because it, asks us to celebrate it, but we celebrate it because it broke a certain barrier in world history. In 1955, Asian and African countries met in Bandung, Indonesia, to set the stage for the post-colonial world, the world after colonialism, where they talked about things like military bases, they talked about things like the wretchedness of imperialism, of the arms spending, of the Cold War, of the suffocation of their countries from development. And then they went to Belgrade in 1961 and found the non-aligned movement. Now it's interesting, at the non-aligned movement in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, you would have had Asian, African, and Yugoslavia, or Asian African countries in Yugoslavia, but again, no Latin American countries, except that 2 years before the non-aligned movement was founded in 1961, the Cuban Revolution took place. And Cuba, early into the career of building socialism on this island in the Caribbean, recognized that its future had to be internationalist. This was a recognition of the Cuban Revolution. And that is the reason why President Dorticos of Cuba goes to Belgrade just 2 years after the revolution and represents Cuba at the founding of the non-aligned movement, and therefore breaks the barrier, or rather builds the bridge between Latin America, Asia, and Africa. So when you ask it, what's the context, the principal context for me shouldn't be drawn from what imperialism is doing. It should be drawn from what we were doing. What we were doing was trying to build a platform of unity of the peoples of Asia and Africa, and then the Cuban Revolution insists that Latin America must be part of this, goes to Belgrade, joins the non-aligned movement, and then a discussion opens up that what do we do with countries that have not yet won their independence, their freedom from colonialism? Because the non-aligned movement was an interstate gathering. You had to already be free. And so the Tricontinental Conference is formed 7 years after the Cuban Revolution. It's incredible that a poor country which had been brutalized by the United States was able to host this major conference of bridge building, Asian, African, Latin American countries to come there and to pledge their fight, not only for the completion of decolonization in Guinea-Bissau, in Guadeloupe, in places that remain under colonial occupation. French Guyana remains under colonial occupation. There's a section on Guadeloupe, remains under French colonial occupation. Yeah? They commit themselves to ending the colonization process, and then they say, we're going to make a better world. And that is really the incredible part of Fidel Castro. The incredible ability. I mean, Manolo and I did this book called Comrade of the Revolution, which I really recommend you look at. Speeches that Fidel gave in the worst moments of the Cuban Revolution. Because this was a revolutionary who could extract hope from defeat. And that's exactly what they were doing in 1966. They were extracting the future from a really terrible situation.
And I think the terrible situation is that the scourge of colonialism, the scourge of US imperialism had its hands everywhere on the planet. I mean, as this is building up, we have revolutionaries in West Africa, in the so-called Portuguese colonies, beginning to really escalate their struggle against the Portuguese Empire. In Angola, in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau, in Cabo Verde. We have also the deepening of the struggle in the Congo. We have the formation in this period of the PLO as a moment of building unity among Palestinian revolutionaries. You have the escalation of the struggle against US imperialism in Vietnam. And particularly in Latin America, in a slightly different context, in which you're not necessarily fighting against colonial domination, you're fighting against neocolonialism and imperialism directly, 1966 is only a year or only a few months after the US intervention in Dominican Republic, which completely drowned in blood an attempt by the Dominican people to return to democracy after over 30 years of US-supported, US-sponsored dictatorship. So it's a moment in which all over the planet, there's an escalation of struggle against US imperialism, against neocolonialism, against colonialism. And the question remained, coming from Bandung, but not just from Bandung, but from years of different organizational processes across the world. I would say we have to give credit. The Soviet Union initiated many of those processes of converging both states, national liberation movements, revolutionaries together. There was sort of the need to sort of take on the final offensive against the colonial regimes remaining in the world. And that couldn't have been possible without the reality of the Cuban Revolution, which in 1959 sort of turned the page and created, I would say, a new correlation of forces, not just in Latin America, but for the rest of the global South, as to what is possible when you bring together the two strands of struggle on the planet, which were really socialist revolutions taking place, but also the national liberation revolutions. These two together crystallized in Cuba, but brought together in the Tricontinental Conference were really like, again, I always call it the call for the last offensive, which we see the effects of it after 1966. And that's, I guess, the story we can keep talking about. But actually, I wanted to also say, because saying all of this, I feel almost nervous to talk about any of this, because we have in the room two esteemed intellectuals of the struggle with us, Rosemary Mealy and Sam Anderson.
Bravo.
Who have been our guides, have been our mentors, have been our elders, but who have guided this intellectual work that we have done for many years out of the People's Forum and out of 1804 books. So this book is also their child.
Yeah.
Thank you for illuminating that for us. You know, I think we can start to feel like these, at least tenuous connections, the ways that we're seeing people rising up around the world today, feeling the similarities. But, you know, before we get too ahead of ourselves in time and, you know, in the conversation, I guess I'm curious about, you know, the actual characters. Who are the people coming to the conference itself? You know, maybe we've heard of them, maybe these pages illuminate different sides of them, or, you know, maybe there are things that we might not get to see in the book necessarily, and, like, you know, you'll read the speeches, but there is other dynamics going on. I know Vijay was laughing and smiling seeing people in the videos. So I'm just curious, like, you know, who are the people who are coming, and also what movements are they representing? What tendencies are they reflective of? Maybe even what were some of the challenges that presented in bringing all of these people together? I think we all can understand coalition building and, like, all of the things that it brings with it. You know, there's always an overriding question of unity, but also there are challenges and there's also people coming together. So I'm just curious about that.
I mean, I spent several months back and forth throughout several years digging in dusty crates in Havana and in other parts of the global South, looking to decipher who was actually there, because we know for sure, you know, the most famous speech to come out of the conference is by Amílcar Cabral. It is perhaps one of the most fundamental texts for the revolutionary movement across the global South. We all know Fidel Castro was there, and his image and his speech, controversial, explosive, you know, monthly review, you know, many things that can be said. But when you go deep into the crates of history, you realize that, in fact, there's deeper stories about so many other figures and movements that were there that we often neglect in our telling of what happens in the global South. For me, for example, we had just been, a few of us from the People's Forum, from the International People's Assembly, had just been in Niger, which we know is going through this tremendous revolutionary process right now of overthrowing the chains of French neocolonialism, together with Burkina Faso and Mali. And when we talk to leaders, both grassroots leaders, but also military leaders in Niger, they always talk to us, about the importance of the Sawaba Party, how that had been the basis, the ideological basis for the revolutionary transformations taking place in Niger today. To then only a few weeks later go to Havana, look in the archives and see how, in fact, the entire leadership of the Sawaba Party had been in Havana for the Tricontinental Conference. To learn, for example, and it was almost like by a wonderful mistake that we pulled a file that we were told not to pull out, but we pulled it nonetheless. And we found out, for example, that Josina Machel, a revolutionary woman leader of the struggle in Mozambique, who had been in the underground, served on the front lines of the armed struggle against Portuguese colonialism, didn't speak at the conference, but actively participated in and led multiple sessions within the conference. We learned about the Puerto Rican delegation that was there. We learned about the Palestinians who were there. We learned about the folks from Yemen who participated. So many different corners of the anti-imperialist and anti-colonial struggle that, again, always get forgotten because they're maybe not the current sites of people's attention, but who together actually made the constellation of what made this conference important, which is not that Cabral and Fidel spoke. I think Ambassador Yudi made the most important comment of the evening. Conferences by themselves don't change reality. It's when ideas actually become incarnated or they become real things, they become mass movements, they become national liberation movements. And that's what this conference did, is that it brought together the unexpecteds, the unknowns of all the national liberation movements, communist parties around the world, and gave them a space to connect with each other and to actually ask each other questions that can be difficult in the movement, but that are necessary for what revolution requires of us. Vijay once commented to me when we were looking over the list, wow, half the people who came to this conference got killed right after. When we look at that, it can be a depressing element to it, but it's also an affirmation that, again, the majority of people who were at this conference were not armchair intellectuals. They were not leaders simply staying at, shifting from one hotel to the other, doing international left tourism. No, they were active leaders of the organizations. And most of them went from the conference, like Amílcar Cabral, straight into the bush, straight into the field, straight into the armed struggle again. And many did meet their end in those struggles. But many of them did succeed. Many of them survived. Many of them, for example, Comandante Pedro Pires of Cabo Verde, of the PAGC, who has written and worked with us over the last few years in rescuing the legacy of Amílcar Cabral, survived to tell the story and share his testimony.
It's a very moving. Firstly, please give Manolo a big round of applause for. No, just this kind of work is not easy. I don't understand why the book wasn't produced immediately afterwards. We would have asked our Commander Fidel, why was this not produced afterwards? But it's now here. And the thing is, when you do see who was there, you recognize something really important. That what brought these people together was a commitment to their struggle, not an ideological line. These were not gatherings that sought purity. These were not gatherings that sought ideological unanimity. These were people who were fighting. And they understood that in the fight, even with your closest comrade, you're going to have some differences of opinion. And it's kind of tiresome, to be informed by people, in our time, who are not in the middle of these existential fights, that, you have slightly 2 degrees off the correct line on this issue or that issue. Why are you doing this or that about Iran? Condemn the Iranians to American bombardment, US bombardment, because, this or that degree of difference from yourself is visible or condemn Venezuela because you don't like this or that. No revolutionary who came to Havana in 1966 would have understood that logic. Because they understood that you build solidarity through the struggle and through the building of trust in each other, not through the purity of line. I mean, Aruna Asaf Ali, who comes from India, is not a communist. But she saw herself in Fidel Castro. She was a revolutionary. During the last phase of India's independence struggle, she was the most wanted revolutionary underground by the British government after 1942 in the Quit India movement. They wanted her, they couldn't find her. She was fierce. When she came to Havana, the first thing she wanted to do was to meet the Federation of Cuban Women. She wasn't going to stand in line to meet Fidel. She wanted to say, where are the women fighters? It's very interesting when Madam Bin came to the non-aligned meeting in Lusaka from Vietnam. She went into the kitchen to talk to the kitchen staff and befriended everybody in the kitchen. They said, where has Madam Bin gone? She's telling every kitchen worker in the Lusaka Convention Center of the non-aligned movement about Vietnam and why they are fighting the armed struggle in Vietnam. These are extraordinary figures of the class struggle. But, you know, many of them are obscured from our vision. Once again, because of this litmus test that people have, where the fight for emancipation is put secondary to the exact assessment they have of the world that you have. They were fighters for emancipation. They gave their lives for emancipation. I always ask people who disagree with figures like Aruna Asaf Ali, she gave her life for emancipation. How much of your life have you given for the same thing?
Thank you for sharing that. I think, you know, looking at this book, it's funny, like, you know, there's all these differences, but also the second half of the whole book is all resolutions. It's everything that they agreed on, every conclusion that they came to after the week of these debates. So, you know, the product of it is unity. The lesson for it is unity and understanding that we all are fighting on the same planet, in the same, not the same conditions, but against a common enemy. And, you know, even talking about all these revolutionaries who may go unmentioned or, you know, think, like, again, hats off to Manolo for uncovering a lot of these names. But, like, you know, I think as I was looking through the book, there was a section with photos on the inside. And I think, and also maybe you can even see it in the video, but that's something that's so moving, I think, about this conference, which is that you can see hundreds of people in a room. I was particularly moved by photos of, like, you know, dinner, of like dinner service, you know, who's literally there giving food to all of these revolutionaries who are all speaking different languages, probably wanting different things. Maybe someone thinks it's too salty, the other one thinks it's not salted enough, you know, like all of these small little human things that are only possible when you are able to see it, when you're able to see all of these speeches, all of these resolutions, and all of these people together in a room and reveal to us the humanity of all of the people who are in this room and the reason why they're fighting. And, you know, even though it is tragic that a lot of them were killed, passed away after the conference itself, their legacies live on. Even Josina Michel, like, you know, we name all of our rooms at the People's Forum after revolutionaries because, you know, we're not naming hospital wings after donors. We're naming our rooms and spaces after people who are actually giving us something bigger than any endowment could be, right? They're giving us tasks, they're giving us lessons, they're giving us futures. So upstairs is the Josina Michel room. This is the Violeta Parra stage. The library over there is Aile Santa Maria. So I think there's so much we can cull from this book as well. But, you know, before I get too ahead of myself, I'm going to warn you that I'm going to turn to you all for questions soon. So now it's time to lock in and think about how do we bring these, how do we take advantage of this opportunity, right? How do we understand this conference in our own struggles? Because again, we're not here to romanticize history, to just think, oh, what a crazy time that was. We're living in crazy times right now. And so how do we understand this today? And so I think my question to you both will be, you know, this is 60 years ago. This is a completely different time with many common threads, but you know, why is it important for young people today or anyone who's fighting today who are upset with the state of the world, who don't know where to go, what to do even? And I think we're seeing this tendency a lot. How do we understand this conference, this study, the study of this book, the study of these lessons, not just as a glamorization of the past, but as a tool for us to use, as a tool for us as organizers, as artists, as students, to apply to our own struggles?
Well, I strongly encourage everyone to read through the book. It can be heavy and even weighty and sometimes even like heavy and boring at times, because you're reading through, I mean, we uncovered hundreds of speeches, of which we only included a small fragment. We're hoping to prepare a second volume. We included all the resolutions, but there were thousands of documents. And when you read through them, you realize that despite the fact that there was a Sino-Soviet split at the same time, the fact that there were major tactical differences between the different political forces within national liberation struggles. I mean, there was a Salvador Allende, who is leading an electoral strategy in Latin America, present in the conference, fully participating and fully admired and applauded, at the same time that you have the Vietnamese as the heroes and stars of the conversation. When you read through these speeches, there actually isn't a tactical debate among them. They're not in these speeches fighting each other on whether it's armed struggle versus electoral struggle. It's not about mass mobilization versus action. It's a building of unity on a common understanding of what imperialism looks like and how it's actually functioning around the world, and a building of unity on the basis that we have to act against it. That at this point in history, and I think it gets reaffirmed even more now when we're facing the Donroe Doctrine, that there is, in fact, no struggle on its own that's capable of defeating imperialism. There is no struggle on its own that will be able to fully put an end to the US empire, but it could only be the conjunction, the coming together, the unity of all forces in struggle, not just in the global south, but actively even within the empire, which was also an important aspect of this conference. It wasn't, there wasn't an official US delegation, but Robert Williams, who was exiled in Cuba at the time, was present. And the conference made actually 2 resolutions, meaning there were 2 important debates within the conference about how the struggle of black people in the United States, but overall the people of the United States, was going to be a determining factor towards the end of US imperialism around the globe. Absolutely. And it's being articulated in this conference by the Vietnamese, by the Cubans, who are already pointing out, the Korean delegates who are pointing out seriously, we have a common struggle. Our task, which Che would summarize only a few months later in his famous message to the Tricontinental, 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams, that we have to essentially launch not just a final offensive, but an offensive on all possible fronts against US imperialism. And I think concretely for us today, we're living literally in the wake of the first general strike in US history in over 80 years. We're seeing major strikes right now in San Francisco by the teachers union. We're seeing the nurses on strike in New York. We're seeing high school students going on walkouts daily across the United States in their thousands. These are not times for tranquility or for calmness. On the contrary, there are times for how do we bring all these struggles together, seeing them as part and parcel of what the Cubans are fighting for at this point, what the Venezuelans are fighting for, which is Vijay summarized into emancipation. I'll put it in even more basic language. We all have a desire to be free, to live with dignity, to have a world without the chains that are imposed on us. That is the dream of the Tricontinental, and that is a dream that lives on even 60 years after. Some of these struggles were resolved in the sense that Namibia is free, Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau are free, but Puerto Rico continues to be a colony of the US. The issues that the Korean delegates brought to this conference about how their country continued to be occupied in the South and how they face a state of constant war is still a reality. The struggle of the Palestinian people that the delegate brought to this conference continues to be true. So there is, I would say, also an unending agenda of decolonization, of anti-colonial struggle that we actually have to take up in our times today.
In fact, it's interesting because the Tricontinental Conference is equidistant between the founding of the Comintern, the Communist International in 1919, which in 1920 at the second Communist International meeting gathered people from across what would become the Third World, from all across the former Tsarist Empire, Central Asia, from China, from India, from Persia, from Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, from the Arab world, and so on. And they would come to Moscow and debate the way forward. What is the colonial question? What is the national question? And so on. And they were debating, in a sense, the question of how fundamentally to make alliances against imperialism. That was in 1920. We have the Tricontinental, I said, equidistant, because we are part of the process that is now the International People's Assembly, now around 10 years old. Yeah, hundreds of political movements across the global south, struggling to build unity in action, find a way to fight against, an imperialism which is monstrous in its military power. I mean, it's monstrous in its military power. It's a different kind of military power. The very fact that United States military can just hover above Caracas, hover 150 aircraft, cut the power, destroy the radar, destroy the air defense systems. Monstrous military power. What they've demonstrated in Gaza, monstrous, brutal, genocidal military power. We are dealing with a beast, truly. A beast. Militarily, it is entirely anti-human. What they did and continue to do in Gaza is anti-human. We are building the People's Front against that. It's from one end of Asia all the way to Hawaii, and then round and round the world, because the world is not flat. And we keep going, trying to bring more movements into motion and into dialogue and conversation with each other. And to radicalize people who are being radicalized by reality. Because in fact, that's the key lesson of a conference like this. You will see many figures here who don't start out radicals. Amílcar Cabral, for instance, is not a radical. Marxism is imposed upon him by imperialism. He was a liberal. He wanted civic struggle. They wrote petitions. And then the Portuguese threw the petition back in their face and fired a bullet. And as the bullet flew towards them, they grabbed Das Kapital and said, "Where do we go?" And they had to go into the forest. Struggle was imposed upon them. Marxism was imposed upon them. It's the same today, wherever we travel. Whether it's to Niger, whether it's to outskirts of Santiago, Chile, where extremely poor young people are reaching for Victor Jara, bringing Victor Jara's lyrics into their hip-hop tradition, reading about Allende. Allende was a liberal. They called it the Socialist Party, but he was a liberal. Imperialism imposed the left-wing agenda on him, and Fidel came and spent a month with him and hugged him and said, "Salvador, You can do it. Be strong. Fidel spent a month in Chile. Yeah, traveled around, gave speeches around the country. I mean, which world leader in the history of the world, modern world, no world leader has gone somewhere and spent a month of their time giving strength and tutelage to somebody. That's the power of internationalist solidarity. We talk about Cuba sends doctors overseas. We forgot it sent its president overseas. It's the only country that's exported the president. That was that, but we are doing it now. And I think I want to underline that. That's the reason why Manolo has made this book. This book isn't merely, This is why we have made this book. It is not merely a scholarly account. It's actually a textbook for the International People's Assembly for movements today. So that people in motion today, in motion however they are in motion. See, because people are in motion in different ways. Somebody is in motion, activated because they saw the shooting of a young woman in her car by a thug in Minnesota. That brought them into motion. Somebody is living in Honduras. They say an election is stolen. They come into motion. People come into motion for all kinds of reasons. And they come into motion in their own way, and we respect that. We don't demand of people that they come into motion like us. But because we believe strongly that communism is the actual movement of history. We believe as people come into motion, capitalism imposes upon them a certain reality. Imperialism narrows their horizon for emancipation, and that radicalizes them. We are always radicalized by reality, not by books. Books give us the guidance. Books give us wisdom. It's reality that radicalizes us. We are not anti-imperialists because we have posters in our home denouncing imperialism. We are anti-imperialists because imperialism imposes upon us the obligation to be anti-imperialists. It's imperialism that has imposed this on me. Somebody says, you are very angry. I am not angry. I am the happiest person in the world. Imperialism is angry. It breathes fire in my face. It breathes fire in my face. I have to respond with something. It's not anger. It's joy because I'm looking past it. I believe it's not with us forever. Our lifetimes are brief, but our struggles are longer. Imperialism is brief. Our victory is certain. That's the lesson of the Tricontinental Conference. That's the lesson of our struggles today. That was for Stephanie. For you, Stephanie. She's our leader of the IPA.
International People's Assembly. Thank you so much, you two. I think I'm actually now thinking, it was like a very early, like years ago you made a speech here, and it was like, it was huge for me. You said, like, I don't struggle because I love to struggle. I struggle because I love to win, you know? And I think that's something we can take with us. We don't struggle because we just love struggling every day, all these long meetings. We struggle because we want to win, right? And so now with that, I open it up to you all for questions to help you win, curiosities, all that stuff.
Thank you. Hello. My name is Daniel Elawar. It's my honor to be teaching here at the People's Forum. Vijay, I don't know if you'll remember meeting me at the American University of Beirut campus when I was teaching there many years ago. My question ties into something you mentioned about the use of lyrics in hip-hop in Chile. And to me, I'm looking at the cover of this book. I see reference to the Tricontinental magazine that was published. I see reference to the OSPAL poster tradition. I think of the Lotus magazine. I see this as an archive and a cultural manifestation. And I'm wondering if you could, and 1804 Books as representing that as well, along with many other publishers. I'm wondering if you could just tie this book back into that as a tradition. We often look to it for ideological input or resolutions, what happened historically. But if you could talk about this as cultural manifestation. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm visiting up here from Philly. Came up. I think the last time I saw you, Vijay, was at Temple speaking. But anyway, you answered the question a little bit, but I was wondering whether you could expound a bit more if there were any other folks, you know, from the freedom struggle in the United States who went to the conference. And it was great to hear that Robert F. Williams was there.
Hi, I would love to know, since you had to cull through so many speeches and wouldn't have known necessarily how many there were, did your original editorial idea, did you let the speeches and the resolutions move you in terms of how you collated and culled what you would include, those voices, those revolutionary voices, and that unity? I'm just interested in that editorial process.
Speaking of the Sahel Alliance, I wonder what your thoughts are on how the economic dismantling of American hegemony and capitalist imperialism by the BRICS countries, and especially the PRC, is sort of influencing liberation struggles in the global South, and maybe even breaking, with Mark Carney's recent Davos speech, maybe even breaking solidarity among the imperial core. And I wonder how you think that economic dismantling is sort of playing out in the global South generally today, for example, with the Sahel Alliance, and if you see that as part of that.
We'll start with those.
All very important questions. I mean, I will confess that when I was very moved, because I'm not an academic by training. I don't have much of a university education to even begin with, and I took on this project of the book mostly because Vijay insisted that we have to recover this history, that we can't, actually your best line was, don't let some academic bastard publish this book.
That was actually true.
Like the movements have to be the ones who do the research and publish this and make this our own. And I took that to heart, and honestly, it was a process. When we started doing this research, the institution that was responsible for most of these archives had already closed, OSPAL. And those archives were kind of being moved in different directions. Nobody really knew where exactly they were. There was a lot of going around, and there were bits of archives in Chile, there were bits of archives in East Germany, there were bits of archives in China, there were archives kind of everywhere, but I was really lucky to go into the archives of the Granma newspaper in Cuba, where the archival team there are these amazing revolutionary elders who've been doing the same job for almost 60 years, actually. And they have this system with wooden shelves that go all the way to the roof. And they have a system where they can track and tell where Fidel was every day of the year from 1959 to 2013. And yeah, the Cubans. Only the Cubans could do this. And when you're faced with this much information, and literally they just started pulling out files and files and files and files and photos and images, reels, handwritten notes. Again, as a non-academic, I honestly didn't know what we were going to do. In fact, I messaged Vijay, I was like, so do we put this all in one book? And Vijay was like, okay, let's start with volume 1. And I think the idea was at least to begin to present a microcosm of what took place at this conference. A taste, a slice of the diversity of the political actors that participated, the regional diversity of movements and organizations that participated, but also, I would say, making it very clear that this is not actually a book about Cuba. This is not a book about any particular movement. It is actually the book of the third world struggle. And that we wanted to give everyone an opportunity to see these documents without our own mediation, in fact, to understand what they wanted to say and what they wanted to express in this particular moment in history. So we had to translate everything, we had to edit things, but we had to basically make sure that people would have access to seeing that these resolutions are the result of lengthy debates and meetings in which people fought and quibbled over the use of one word or another, or where the commas were going to go, why we were going to put an exclamation point on one end or not on the other. This is real struggle. And that's what shaped the book. I mean, I'm amazed that this is here. Because it's really the labor of love of Kate who really did the amazing work, painstaking work of putting this actually together. But this is really the summary of the work of real revolutionaries grappling with real questions and trying to go back into struggle. And you find things that you also didn't expect along the way. One of the really interesting things to your question is, because it was conceived as a conference of the third world movements, there were no official guests from Europe or the United States. It was an explicit decision. In fact, there were some debates initially about whether they were going to let the Yugoslavians participate because of their role in the non-aligned movement. Would they let certain movements from Europe participate or from the US? And to maintain a certain principle and coherence, they decided only third world movements participated. But they invited observers from all over the world, including from Europe, Japan, and the United States. And Robert F. Williams was the main person there representing the United States. As an observer, he was actually allowed to participate and speak openly in the conference, and he met with, in fact, he's featured in the book. There's an image of him discussing with Comandante Victor Dreke, one of the important leaders of the Cuban Revolution, a historic internationalist who's still alive today. But there was another important US presence there, which is that Josephine Baker, civil rights activist, revolutionary in her own right, anti-fascist fighter, partisan, was threatened by the State Department to not participate in this conference. And apparently that was what got her over the line. So she, covering a lot of her own costs, traveled to Havana, Cuba from France, participated in the conference, actually participated and observed many of the meetings, but also performed and made a special concert at the famous Havana Libre, formerly the Hilton, for the delegates. And it was a very transformative moment for her because she actually knew Cuba before 1959. She had performed in the mafia-owned hotels, the corrupt mafia-owned hotels of Cuba before the revolution. Lastly, on the cultural question, because I actually think one of the commitments when you read the resolutions, when you read the work of the Tricontinental Conference, is that there was a commitment to actually engage in the work of creating political literacy. How do we get millions of people across the world to actively engage with revolutionary ideas in this moment? And immediately the output of the conference was to create OSPAL that would actively have not just a theoretical journal, which is Tricontinental as we know it, the Tricontinental magazine, which became world famous, but to actively create a radio program in multiple languages that would be transmitted from Radio Havana, but also transmitted from many different parts of the world. The reel shows elements of that radio being prepared. They also guaranteed that there would be an output of graphic design, which is now world famous. We see the posters that have been shared all over the world. The Cubans engineered this beautiful method of folding them into magazines and shipping them all over the world free of cost most of the time, to guarantee that There would be posters of the day in solidarity with the Korean struggle, posted not just on university campuses in the US where it's cool, but actively posted in guerrilla camps of the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party in Angola. And they would be posted in the camps in Lebanon. And they would be posted in movement headquarters and offices all over the global South. But also, continuing on the history that came out of Bandung, they actively organized sectors of writers, of artists. There was originally the Afro-Asian Writers Association, which continued under OSPAL and expanded to include Latin American writers. A year or 2 years after this conference, they organized a conference on culture, a Congress on culture in Havana, that became the Congress of revolutionary artists from across the global South. So culture was never seen as like a afterthought. It was actually an integral part of the political strategy of fighting imperialism, literally gun in hand, mobilization, electoral struggle, all means, and the pencil and the brush, the film reel, everything that we can to throw against the enemy.
Daniel's question about the culture is obviously extraordinarily close to me because I adore painting and paintings, and I would ask you to subscribe to the material from Tricontinental, the Institute for Social Research, which is named in honor of the conference, and also not just of the conference but in honor of the legacy of what we call the battle of ideas and the battle of emotions. For instance, tomorrow's newsletter is a long poem. It's the second time I'm risking having written a poem and sharing it with people. It's a poem about the brutality of the banks in the world of drugs. You know, the United States government says Nicolas Maduro Moro, president of Venezuela, narco trafficker. You know who the real narco trafficker is? HSBC and all the other big banks, because their liquid capital is coming from the so-called underground money. And the newsletter, the poem starts with that and then goes to the campesinos. Because the campesinos in Cauca, which we had visited as a team to do the research for the text that came out of that thing, the dossier from this month called War on the Poor, it goes to the campesinos of Cauca who would actually prefer to grow something else. Like, they don't want to grow coca. They don't make anything really growing coca. But they grow coca because, well, nobody's buying the potatoes, or nobody's going to buy the tomatoes from Colombia. The flowers. I mean, the cut flower industry is brutal. Yeah, the global value chain is brutal. So they grow coca. They don't make much. Yeah. The kids on the street here who sell a bag of cocaine don't make much. They make minimum wage. Somebody's making the money. So that's the poem tomorrow. Why? Because we believe it's a battle of ideas on the one side, but also the battle of emotions. It's the battle of emotions. We grew up as children in India reading UNESCO's Courier, another magazine of importance, literacy magazine. It's a great magazine. It used to tell you about world events. We grew up with the Lotus magazine. Lotus is so important for our history, and I know why you asked about Lotus, because Tariq Mahmood harassed us every day about the bloody Lotus this, Lotus that, and Tariq Mahmood now has a book out on Lotus, yeah? Okay, but that was the magazine of Afro-Asian poetry. Imagine you're sitting somewhere in the Kazakh Socialist Republic and you're reading Faiz Ahmed Faiz, or you're reading a short story by then James Ngugi. Who was doing that? Well, we were. Guess where we read our material from? From Progress Publishers, Soviet Union. Translated books from Latin America. We read it from foreign language publishing house Beijing, translated Ding Ling. That's the first Chinese writer I ever read. Ding Ling short stories about rural China. I thought, wow, this is just like India. But she was writing before the revolution. Stories of rural life before the revolution. I mean, building a humanity. Because you grew up in your country. You don't know what it's like to be part of humanity. It's when you read fiction about other places that you see that the world is a mirror. And that however different cultures are, we belong to the same humanity. United States bombs Nigeria. Yeah? Human beings. You read a short story about a village in northern Nigeria. You see something of your own children in the story. And you think, they bombed my family. They bombed humanity. It's not Nigeria. United States right now has a presence in northern Nigeria on the ground. They are preparing to invade Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali to attack and destroy the alliance of Sahel states. Front line for us to defend. People are debating, well, it's a military coup. Sorry, guys. I'm sorry that your perfection isn't available in the world. But I'm going to defend them. Because they are building something important. The people who criticize Ibrahim Traoré today would have cheered when Thomas Sankara was killed. Thomas Sankara is my hero. When I was in college, I had a picture of him on my wall. It was cut from a magazine. Such a beautiful man. I didn't even know he played the electric guitar at the time. The battle of emotions. It's a powerful thing. Yeah, we are fighting for an emotional resonance against imperialist culture. Imperialist culture corrodes our brains, makes us alienated from each other. Yeah, makes us despise each other. A socialist culture makes us understand humanity. We are trying in the battle of emotions to recover people from corrosion. That's important. Brother, your question about the world changing now is a very complicated question. But I can tell you one thing. You come and read all our Tricontinental Institute materials, the answer is there. Okay, it's the gospel. Because that's exactly what we work on. Yeah, I don't want to get onto it now because let's take some more questions, okay?
More questions. Oh, I want to go to our friends in the back.
Thank you so much. It's not so much a question, but as a gift. You bring us this important document on the centennial of Fidel's birthday, his birth. And I think that that is a very important contribution as we reflect. So that's the first thing I just want to share. The second is when People's Forum has a new home, we have Tricontinental posters that we will share so you can have an exhibit.
My name is Sam.
Just a second, Sam. Okay. I just want to say that I'm going to arm wrestle Manolo for some of those posters. So just to put it on the table.
Right. It's on loan. Okay. It's not. We're not giving them away. I just want to point out a little piece of personal history in terms of the Tricontinental in 1966. I was 22, 23 years old. I was in SNCC. I was helping to form the Black Panther Party. I was also in the Black Arts Movement. I was a member of the Revolutionary Action Movement, which was a clandestine group. Tricontinental was, that conference was essential for those of us young people in the United States to make our next move in terms of study and struggle. And we felt that we were there because Robert Williams had a radio program called Radio Free Dixie that was broadcast from Havana into the United States. And late at night, it would be able to travel, in those days it was AM, right? Be able to travel all the way up to New York City, be able to hear it late at night. And so we were informed about that. Afterwards, as was mentioned, the poster work was mailed free within Grandma to whoever in the United States wanted it. And so many of us had Grandma almost every week, unless the U.S. government confiscated it every once in a while. But we collected the posters. Even as young people, we realized that these were masterpieces of art, right? And that we had to keep them, we had to preserve them. That's a little.
Hi, my name is Janae. Oh. A lot of my work is based on, I guess, helping what you would call like the lumpen proletariat, like the sex workers, the unemployed, the homeless, the disabled, all of the people who are kind of fall to the bottom. And my main struggle is convincing the people who are not a part of that group that the struggles of that group are the same as the struggles they face, even though it's not the same extreme. And I struggle to find a way to bring the two groups together, like the people who have and the people who don't, and the people who don't also happen to be people who partake in, I guess what we would call like morally gray jobs, pastimes, things to get them through life. So I guess just how to deliver that to people who may not have had to make those choices in their life in a way that brings everybody together for the same reasons.
Hey, so it's been 60 years since this conference, and I think like there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from the content, of course. I'm very excited to read this book, but I don't like to think of history as a prescription, but rather something that we read to learn the lessons from, both like the positives and potentially the mistakes. And in the 60 years since this conference, it feels like it's been many gut punches in terms of like the seeing things happening in the third world and things happening with third world movements. So I'm curious to hear just some reflections on like the impact of this conference and what, like, of course we've talked about their successes, but I'm curious about what you think the failures were and how we can learn from them.
Hi.
Hi. I was just reading Darker Nations, actually, and I found out yesterday this was going to happen, so I went back to read the Havana chapter. But I'm going to try to get to a question, but there's so many like twisted ironies as you're reading like the history of the third world. I was also just reading that Indonesia is the first country that's potentially sending like 5,000 troops to this international stabilization force in Gaza, which they were having a very hard time. A lot of people joining Board of Peace, a lot of hard time saying who's going to actually send their troops on the ground there. And then, of course, Bandung being the launch of this non-aligned movement. So all these twisted ironies at play, and especially new institutions being formed as well. The Board of Peace, right? It's not just holding down the United Nations, which used to be a much stronger place for the third world to be able to represent themselves, but now creating even more facades and even more charades. So the question I think is, what is the role of fighting against the new institutions as well? Because there's the IPA, there's maybe trying to rejuvenate the United Nations, but there's also, I mean, how do we destroy the Board of Peace as well? I mean, we stand for peace, but obviously not the Board of Peace, so.
Hi. I actually had a nearly identical question, but I was just wondering about what you guys think of solidarity between states and the global south in this current conjuncture, but if you could more particularly give an answer focusing on the Latin American region in the context of the Trump's aggression and the Donroe Doctrine and then the everything happening in Latin America right now.
We'll take yeah, someone who has the mic over there. We'll take that last question, and then I think that's plenty for our speakers to work through.
Yeah, I think my question sort of like ties into what others have asked. I really like, Vijay, when you said you struggle to win. I come from Hyderabad, where we had multi-generational people's movements, each of which we have won, and each of which has ended up with an electoral solution which is co-opted by the same feudal lords who the people were fighting against. And now the USP of these state governments is, or like their career highlight is getting MOUs with companies based out of Seattle. And so how do you sort of like, what are the lessons if something came out of the conference on like similar lines, or like what do we make of these wins which don't really end up where we want them to be?
Actually, almost all the questions are very similar, except the question about those who fall to the bottom. Yeah, every other question is very similar. And there's the best friend ever in the whole history of humankind is Frederick Engels, because he tended to Marx's writings with love that nobody else has ever demonstrated in the history of humankind. And also when Marx published Contributions to a Critique of Political Economy, he wrote not one review, not two reviews, all on different names, not 3 reviews, but 4 reviews. So if you guys want to befriend us, you got to review this book. At least a Facebook post. Come on, guys. A tweet, a Facebook post, Instagram story. Yeah, something. Give us something, okay? Yeah, okay. Freddie Engels, 4 full reviews. In one of the reviews, he said that history doesn't move in a straight line. It's one of the most poignant rebuttals of the very disturbing way in which Marxism was attacked as a progressive historical methodology. As if Marxists believed, ridiculously, that everything keeps getting better. It's ridiculous to ascribe to Marxism this idea of sort of, let's say, liberal utilitarianism, that everything will keep getting better for more and more people. No Marxist has ever believed that. But Engels, in 1859, writes that history moves not in a straight line pointing upward, but in zigs and zags. There are always advances and then reversals. Because the class struggle is a struggle. It's not a one-way street. It's a terrible struggle. And sometimes we gain something, but we don't know how to consolidate the gains. So for instance, electoralism, in our time, has been swamped by money. So you can have mass movements. Tomorrow, 250 Indian workers will go on strike. 250 million Indian workers will go on strike tomorrow. 250 million workers will go on strike tomorrow. It will be, again, one of the biggest general strikes in world history, etc., etc. But then in these same areas, the right will win the election. Why? Because they have over 85% of all the campaign money that we publicly know about. The rest that is not publicly known is all to them anyway. The left doesn't have campaign money. We can't easily consolidate our popular struggles into electoral victories because bourgeois democracy is being eroded. Look at the United States, a great example. Yeah, I mean, okay, you won a mayoral contest in New York City. Yeah, if you can't win in New York City, it's crazy. I mean, it's crazy that Rudolph Giuliani was ever the mayor. A pathetic example of human leadership. I don't even know how a city like this could elect somebody like that. Zoran Mamdani is a good mayor for a city like this. Complicated, mixed up, yeah? Sort of left of center, He's got a deal with the rats and the garbage, and it's a mayor's job. He's not become the president of the country. He's elected mayor of a city. It's an adequate mayor of the city. But try to elect somebody to, a left-wing, real, genuine left person to Congress or something, you'll get killed by the money. So these are all tangible political barriers that are placed before us. That as we struggle, as we win, we have to theorize them. We can't keep fighting the same way and failing in the same way. They say if you're too afraid to lose, you won't fight. So you have to be afraid of winning, really. Because when you win, what do you do then? Do you have a program? If you come to power, do you know what you'll do? And for instance, that's the reason why we have our research institute and we are linked to other research institutes. We are trying to create a project for winning. Our version of Project 2050. You see, there's nothing wrong with the right having a Project 2050. I never understood why people were horrified. Oh my God, they thought about the future. Oh my God, that's terrible. Planning is essential. They plan, we don't. Our academics, our intellectuals, I don't know what they're doing. But they're not helping our movements. They're not doing their task, which is to be alongside the movements, producing the tangible projects for tomorrow. What do you do if you win an election in Sri Lanka? What happens in Senegal? Center-left governments. Where are the intellectuals to assist them? Part of the whole project of the Tricontinental Conference was not just to critique US imperialism. It was to try to imagine what comes next. And that's our task now. Zigs and zags. Twisted ironies, you called it. Yeah? They're not so much ironies as defeats. They're not ironies, they're defeats. Indonesia was a defeat. Struggling now to emerge from defeat. Marxism is banned in Indonesia. Marxist political parties banned in Indonesia. Yeah, the reason you saw large-scale protests in Indonesia for Palestine is people are heartsick about the genocide in Gaza. But the government, zigs and zags. We move, None of this disorients us. Why are we interested in analysis like this? We have to be clear-headed. When we see something like the Indonesians sending 5,000 soldiers, that doesn't dishearten me. That's why I say not twisted irony. It's a class struggle. That should not dishearten us. We should be clear. We should have a theory of the world that clarifies the situation. That's what we anticipated that they would do, Board of Peace. We anticipate that. We fight it. Right now, you want to dismantle the Board of Peace like I want to fight to liberate the Palestinian political prisoners. Why is Marwan Barghouti in jail? Why is Ahmad al-Sadat in jail? They need to be free. They need to be deciding on behalf of the Palestinian people the direction for Palestine, not the Board of Peace. But if the Israelis keep them in jail, then Palestine doesn't have its representatives. Then you have to substitute Donald Trump for Palestine. Because the Israelis are keeping them in jail, not the Americans. And we need to be fighting for that. So in that sense, I say to you, it's a theory. The theory that we operate with is the theory of zigs and zags, of class struggles, not of defeats. Lenin has an amazing essay on the importance of temporary compromises. Got to always be prepared to make a temporary compromise. That's politics. The essence of Marxist politics is to look at politics directly in the eye, not shirk away from its atrociousness. Look it directly in the eye and make decisions with a cold-hearted sense of reality in order to always be ready to advance the class struggle, if not immediately tomorrow. That's what our purpose is, yeah? We want the class struggle to advance on the behalf of those who fall to the bottom. Now, how you do it, sister, that's up to you. That's your job. You know it better than I. You are there. It's about communication. And it's about advancing that class struggle, which is going to make sure we are not disheartened by the zags. The zag must never dishearten us. Every time there's a zag, we know that the people are with us. The zig is coming.
I don't know what is there left to say after that. I mean, yeah, it's a zig and zag, but I think after 66, it wasn't all victories, actually. I mean, there were many setbacks in that same time period. I mean, one of my fellow countrymen, Guido Gil, literally leaves this conference and 1 year later is killed in his living room by U.S.-sponsored death squads in the Dominican Republic. Many revolutionary processes did not come to power after this conference. Some did. But ultimately, I think the message, the lessons, the things that carry forward for us in this time period is that Fidel taught it, but the Chinese revolutionaries learned these lessons, the Korean revolutionaries taught this lesson, the Vietnamese revolutionaries, everyone taught this lesson, which is no defeat is permanent. And of the constant need to extract hope precisely out of situations that feel like setbacks, that feel like defeats. We're probably living in the moment of the greatest lethal offensive by US imperialism in quite some time. We can say for a fact that it will get worse in this coming period. But that should not produce the sense of despair as to we are helpless against this even more lethal gangster hyper-imperialism. On the contrary, every time I think I don't have the energy to figure out what we have to do today, I look up at the videos of the Cubans saying we're not going to surrender. I just saw a video just before we started of a Cuban official saying, what is there to negotiate with the US? We are not going to negotiate our independence. So if the Cubans, on an island of only 11 million people, in the year 2026, 60 years of the Tricontinental, can firmly look into the horizon and say, we are not defeated, we will not surrender, we still have a political project to keep building, which is socialism, and if we save socialism on Cuba, there will be hope for socialism in the rest of the planet, then we all know what our tasks are. Our task is continue to fight, not until the end, but actually to the end of this empire.
Please give a hearty round of applause to our speakers, to the ambassador, to all of yourselves for participating today. Okay. So I hope you're all taking notes because it sounds like we've got a list of tasks to do. Sounds to me like we're getting the book. Sounds to me like we perhaps are subscribing to Vijay's newsletter so we can read his poem tomorrow. The Tricontinental Institute for Research. Sounds like we are bringing Cuba into all of our struggles, everything that we do. It's central, because it is central, right? Right? Okay, excellent. And it sounds like we have to fight so that we can win, right? I want to add one more task to your list, if you'll let me. Who here enjoyed the program tonight? Well, that's incredible to see because that gives us a lot of hope as people at the People's Forum, that this programming is something that nurtures our movements, that nourishes us in the struggle, but also this programming literally would not be possible without all of your support. We're called the People's Forum because we're here to serve the people, but also because it is of the people. Everything that happens here is because of you all and because of your support. Donate is what I'm saying. To cut it short, I can wax poetic about this. So, and before they leave, the URL is peoplesforum.org/future, right? because we're building a future. I'm here to ask because Sam and Rosemary are mentioning we have a new building, because we do have a new building. The lease for this space ends in 2027, which means we have taken the bold leap on the faith of all of the people who are in this room today, who are part of our programming, who come to our classes, who come to our movie screenings, who are coming to all of the courses we're doing. Because we understand and we hope, we are betting on all of you to make this space possible. So we bought a building on 14th Street. It's my hometown, my home neighborhood. And it's super exciting. It's super exciting we have a building, but it is a shell. I have been there. There is a bucket of liquid. I don't even know what it is, right? And I want to get it out of there. And to do that, we need funds. We need to build walls, to make the floor lower, like that costs an exorbitant amount of money. To make the elevator bigger so it's actually accessible, that also costs an exorbitant amount of money. So that's all to say that if you believe in programming like this, if you believe in the future of the People's Forum, we need your help. So donate, pull out your phones, peoplesforum.org/future. If you think you're gonna forget month to month, you can set a recurring one. I won't stop you. $5 a month, that's like a coffee, that's like, whatever subscription you've got. But it's for meaningful programming like this. And so I entreat you all to take up the responsibility of being part of the People's Forum, to continue coming to our events, and also take up responsibility for this important task. So without further ado, any final words? All right, Finn, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. The books are available at the front. Thank you.